Hi, everybody. This is the Allegory Story. My name is Tegan Aline.
My name is Nell Nevis.
And this is our second podcast. So we're like figuring some things out. It's
Yep.
all been very fun and exciting so far. In our last podcast, Mel kind of led us through the story of Sleeping Beauty. And today we're going to be talking about another like classical princess fairy tale, which is Cinderella. So you told me in the last podcast you didn't really like Sleeping Beauty. I never really liked it either. What's your take or thoughts on Cinderella?
I mean, the Disney version, I loved the mice. I loved that there was a fairy that sang
Yes.
Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. I'm an animal lover, so the fact that, you know, I can go to the park, like I'll go to High Park sometimes,
Mhm.
and have birdseed, and like little birds will come and eat out of my hand, and I feel
Girl,
like one
stop.
of those
Seriously?
princesses. Yeah, I've got pictures actually. So I loved that aspect of Cinderella. That
I think
particular aspect, I like absolutely adore.
I think there's a lot of people that gravitate to the fact that she's so kind to animals. So
Mhm.
I totally get that. And you just reminded me of the most wild thing. So originally, we were supposed to tape this podcast last week, and we found out my computer is a big old baby and it wouldn't really, we couldn't do it. So after you and I did this podcast, Michael and I went to the grocery store, and we were in the grocery store, and I kid you not, Bippity Boppity Boo was playing on the music in the grocery store. And Michael and I
That's
were
so
like,
ridiculous.
this is so wild. Like, have you ever heard of a Disney song being played? Never mind in a grocery store, but like in a French grocery store.
Well,
Oh,
that's
and that
just
was the
it.
thing. It was in French. It was in
It was in
French. The whole
French?
song was in
Oh,
French. It was
I
weird
kinda
and
like that.
freaky. Yeah, it was cool. I said to
How
Mike,
does Bibbidi
nobody's
Bobbidi Boo go in French?
well, they
And,
still
like
say bibbity boppity boo. It's
well, I
just like
know,
the
but, like,
rest of the words are in
the
French.
rest of it.
I don't know. Put it together and what do you got? It's in
Oh
French, but
my
I
gosh.
can't translate that. So for double reference, Mel and I are friends from Toronto. We know each other from Toronto. She still lives in Toronto, but I live in France now, and I live in the southwest of France. And I'm particularly mentioning it because it's gonna come up today, because there's a lot of French connection to these stories that I didn't originally like realize was a thing. You know what I mean? I had no
Yeah,
idea.
it's crazy how connected they are, and especially when you look at the Disney version, because I think that Walt Disney took a lot from specifically the French origin
Yeah,
rather than like the Grimm's fairy tale origin, which is also
right.
very intriguing.
Right. So, you know what? I will be dead honest with you. When I did my research for this, I didn't go too far into the grim fairy tale side of it, because I kind of get like fairy tales are kind of famous for their in their own way, in their own right, and I feel like they're
Yeah.
versions of a lot of these stories, but they're dark, right? Like
They're
I don't
so
know if
dark, and I'll tell you it later, whether it's on the podcast or not. Like, I've got a whole book of Grimm fairy tales that I've had for years, so
yeah.
I'm familiar with them, but yeah.
I grew up with the collection of Grimm's fairy tales when I was younger, and I was always really confused reading them because I was like, I don't understand. But all this to say, I think that the Grimm's fairy tales thing can be a whole like episode in its own right, like maybe a
Yeah, it
bonus
could be its
episode or
own
something like
thing,
that.
so we don't have to go into it, but more to
Yeah,
say that Disney, like Walt Disney, focused, at least for Cinderella, I think more so on the French side,
on
like
the
the
French
French
version.
version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, when I was growing up, I absolutely loved the Cinderella story. It was my movie. I don't really know what exactly pulled me to it when I was young. Probably the dress, because we all know like I'm a total simp for fashion. So that probably had something to do with it. But I never knew how that story was going to weave in and out of my life as I grew and whatever. And I think over the last couple of years, especially with like social media apps like TikTok, we've seen a lot of like heavy criticism of, even Twitter has done a lot of heavy criticism of Cinderella, claiming that it's a story about a woman who just sits and waits, for a man to come and save her. And I really, really feel like that really devalues like the character of Cinderella and the role that she plays. And like this is just kind of strictly in the context of the Disney story, the story that's connected to Charles Perrault, who we talked about in the last podcast. We'll talk about him more later. But I really think that it kind of represses who she was, because I think one of the things that people like about her so much is that she was like a very compassionate person. My mom
Yeah.
used to call her, when I was a little girl, my mom used to call her the first humanitarian. And I don't know if that's like actually like a true thing to say, really,
No.
but like it's not. And
No.
let it be known, I am not a historian, nor, and a lot of this is going to be speculation. But I get what my mom's point was, and I think
Mhm.
it was that the fact that she believed in people, like people could make mistakes, she would still be kind to them. And also she cared a lot about animals. And I was trying to like look that up before this podcast, like is there a name for a person that cares about people and animals and nature like all in one? Is there one name for that? But I couldn't find anything. Can you
No.
think of one?
No, what came to mind is not true, or like the word that came to mind was just druid, but I think that really just
Well, you know, it's really funny that you say that. Okay, so like on that note, we'll dive into the history a little bit because it's really interesting. Um, Apparently, the oldest story of like the oldest version of Cinderella actually comes from 7 BC. So is
she
that the seventh?
old. Oh man.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a Greek story told by a geographer named Strabo. I hope I'm saying that
Mhm.
right. I don't really know. In the story of Rhodopis.
I've
So
heard of
in
this. Okay, yeah. Tell.
You've heard of this. So
I
in
have,
this
yeah.
this is the story about how a Greek slave girl ends up marrying the Egyptian king who was ruling over the area at the time. And in this story, basically she's bathing and an eagle comes and picks up her sandal and flies all the way to where this king is.
Woo.
drops it in his lap. And I got the idea based on the story that probably it was quite a different distance that this eagle flies to drop off this shoe. But he
Nice.
drops off this sandal in the king's lap. The king is like the king of Egypt at the time, the pharaoh, I guess I should say. I hope. I don't know. I don't know a lot of, I haven't explored my Egyptian history yet. But, anyways, he's sitting in an open air space, like delegating justice. People are coming to court saying like this thing happened, whatever. And then all of a sudden this sandal drops in his lap and he looks at it and he finds it like really interesting and unique and he becomes fascinated with it. And this spurs him to now find the woman that this sandal belongs to. It ends up being this Greek slave girl and she ends up marrying this king and becomes like a queen basically.
Okay.
So that's kind of like the original story. I think,
Interesting.
yeah, it is interesting. I think from the beginning, I've heard people call Cinderella pick me girl, and in the past I've been kind of like offended by that. But I do see the context for it the more I explore the
Well,
story of it. But it's not her choice. Let's put it that way.
no, it's kind of interesting because to me, even this version of Cinderella, it plays into the issue of class quite a bit.
Absolutely. Yes.
right? So
And that
it's interesting to see that even back in like 6th, 7th century BCE, that this was, it still carries through with the European versions of the tales that came about later.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a really important observation because I also had the same observation. And it's something I wanted to talk about because even in the very beginning of the story, there is some type of moral underlining about, being chosen and
Hmm.
being able to change your life by being chosen.
She's the
And
pretty woman of her time.
yes, yes. 1001% yes. And I think this is really important when we start to look at like the French adaptation of this story. But before the French adaptation, we have the oldest version, which is this Greek story. It also appears in different variations and forms through in Chinese culture, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Japanese. There's different variations of it that
Hmm.
come from the 8th century and on. So not who's to say where the story even started first? Did the Romans or like the Greeks spread it out east? We don't know, but the story got around.
Yeah, it's interesting how it did get around. I mean, I remember reading at one point, just with European, like the European versions alone, that there are over like 500 of them,
Yeah.
right? And then you take into consideration the fact that there's also versions in Asia and in
Mhm.
Africa and like all over the place. Like
Yes,
it's crazy how it travels.
it even makes its way into somehow into Arabic literature in the stories of Arabian Nights, basically.
Cool. Oh my
So
god, I just
there's
got it.
a version.
Sorry. I got a really nice copy of that recently at PMP. Sorry.
That's exciting. No, I'm excited because I think as we follow these stories, they're going to like kind of take us around the world in a way, and especially when we start to like hone in on different cultures and their stories as we go further. I'm
Hmm.
really excited. It's exciting. Like that is exciting. I'm excited for you to have that book. As we kind of continue, like I said, there's tons of different references, different versions of this story that go on and on. I think there's many, many listed online. And then we kind of come to the 12th century in Europe again, so medieval era
Hmm.
and again, with the story taking on a new name. So it often has different names. It's been called Cinderella. It's been called the Glass Slipper. It's also been called in French. Where is it in my notes? I started to write really small because I was like, here we go. So in the 12th century, it comes into Europe and in France, actually, as Le Fresne. And Le Fresne is a similar story to the rest of them, except
Right.
things start to change. Le Fresne is like the translation is the Ash Girl.
Oh,
So
okay. Yes. Okay.
yeah. So it gets double interesting because at this time, the ash girl is not referring to cinders from a fire, like as we know in in the classical story. The
Hmm.
ash girl is actually referring to the ash tree because there are adaptations of the story, early adaptations, medieval adaptations, where Cinderella's mother dies, and when she's buried and they plant an ash tree on top of her grave. And this is where, yeah, and
Interesting.
this is where Cinderella goes to pray or goes when she's sad. There's other adaptations as well where she's a twin and she's given to an orphanage and there's an ash tree there that she's praying to. So there's
Interesting. Oh, okay.
yeah.
Okay. I wonder how was it just language, like development of language that transitioned this from the ash tree, like her being an ash girl, like and connected with the ash tree to her being an ash girl covered in cinders?
I think it's probably like with the times as things change. So I did a little
Mm-hmm.
bit of digging into, so you have to think of medieval France in the 12th century would have been much far after, way after Roman invasion. France would have been more like France at this point. But like
Mm-hmm.
there's still those old symbolisms, like even to this day living in France there's still old symbolisms kind of through everything. So when I looked into like, like what the symbolism is behind an ash tree, it was really interesting because what ended up coming up was immortality, protection, and being reborn.
Oh.
So I think as this story grows, the meanings behind all of these things, and I never even when you think of Cinderella being covered in ash, I never really thought about it before, but there is that whole like sense of phoenix rising. You know what I mean? Like coming out of literally coming out of the
True. Yeah, yeah.
ashes,
Being reborn.
which I
Yes.
never thought about. And I think that in some ways that theme kind of like plays over as the story evolves. It might be also part of why the story was carried for so long throughout time, because
Mm-hmm.
it's really like a story about hopefulness for a singular person, that a singular person's like life can be changed. And I think that's the positive message of it. But I also think like most things in our society, in our world, I also think that the Cinderella story was used as a look over there kind of situation. If you know what I mean.
Very well. It could be. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
yeah, so in one of the adaptations of Cinderella from this era, her mother is buried, and then they plant the ash tree on top. And so instead of having a fairy godmother, it's actually the spirit of her mother coming to her through the ash tree, helping
Oh,
her
I like that.
change. Yeah, it's really beautiful actually. It's sweet. And
Yeah, I
I
like
think it
that.
does actually play over into like the more modern adaptations of Cinderella, because her, like, even I think the most recent one is the Disney live action one. And her mother's kind of like persistent there, that she should like always be kind and loving and that kind of thing.
Yes.
So I think you can kind of
Yeah, so
see
that
traces of
energy
that.
still remains.
Yeah. So,
I
okay.
kind of like that better than the fairy godmother, though, to be completely honest. And I think it's also maybe just the fact that people were so much more comfortable with death at that point. And as we became less comfortable with it, that's where fairy godmothers started to play more of a role of like magical beings coming into play to act as a guardian, maybe.
Maybe. I don't know how medieval Europe felt about death. I think they probably didn't like. There was
Oh,
like a lot of death going
they didn't
on.
like it, but I think that it was so common, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
they were a lot more used to it than we are now.
There's something comforting about the idea of like somebody dies and their spirit can be connected still through nature. And I think
Hmm.
that's really interesting. That's like a rare, maybe not so rare, but like a more rarer example of seeing that idea of like spirit and being connected through nature coming out in a European story. We see that a lot in other cultural stories, but not so much in European ones. So
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I think a lot of tales in general are just like civilization versus nature, and the two battle it out,
and that's
right?
why
Like
this
the Epic of Gilgamesh is like that too.
and that's why these stories are kind of interesting, because, well, at least in the story you kind of feel like that blend. And even in the story we talked about last week with Sun, Moon, Talia, it felt like there was more of a combination of those things.
Hmm.
So anyways, we get to this Italian guy that we talked about last week. And I can never pronounce his
Jean-Baptiste Basile.
Jean-Baptiste
Right?
Basile. I don't know if that's
Yeah.
how you pronounce it, but I'm taking your lead on that one because
I also don't know if that's how you pronounce it. So apologies to anyone that we've offended.
listen, guys, we are not historians. We are not like official. We just love this stuff and we geek for it and we're doing our best. So bear with us. We're trying to connect the dots. And the more we read and the more we learn, the more we'll grow, right? I think. So, yeah, he writes this book called the what is it?
Pentamarone?
But thank you. Your Italian accent's fantastic.
Thank
Pentomone,
you.
where he has now collected a series of folk tales. And we talked about this in the podcast a bit last week. So it also included Sleeping Beauty. It includes this story, Cinderella. It includes Little Red Riding Hood, which is another one we're going to cover. And some, I think Puss in Boots is one as well.
Yeah, very loose version of it. Yeah.
So I want to say, like, I mean, technically, they call this the first like European literary version of a collection of these stories. So that's kind of, I don't totally get that, but I get it based on timelines because Greece wasn't really part of Europe, but like,
Well, it's the first published
yeah,
version.
first published book.
Yeah.
And then 63 years later, we get a rewrite of almost the same, I think the exact same set of stories, but in French.
Yep. Very similar. Mm-hmm.
By a guy named Charles Perrault. And I'm hoping I'm saying that right. Any of my French people listening, please don't crucify me if I didn't say that right. He writes a book in 1697 called The Histoire, un conte de temps passé, which is like the history of stories of time past, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so he translates this other book that was written in Italian. He now translates it into French. And this, for me, is actually where the story gets really interesting. Really, really interesting. I geeked out and I kind of went a bit down a rabbit hole as to what was going on in and around the time that he wrote this adaptation. And I think it's really interesting.
It is really interesting because I feel like, again, these fairy tales with each adaptation, it's really indicative of the society at the time. And I think that is very clearly expressed in Perrault's version.
Right. So Charles Perrault, right? He's a secretary. He's a secretary to the minister to King Louis XIV. King Louis XIV, aka the Sun God, the Sun King. So picture now in your mind,
extravagant Louis XIV.
So picture now in your mind Versailles, because he created Versailles.
It's very pretty there, yeah.
And he created.
It's so nice.
Side note, Michael and I, okay, this is super funny and a side note and not relevant to like where I'm going with this. Well, it kind of is. I don't know. Michael and I went to Versailles a few years ago. And when we were walking through, we saw all these like really cheesy portraits of like, you know, like French guys.
Yeah.
From the 1600s. And Michael and I were kind of giggling at how floofy like all of the portraits were, but we actually saw the portrait of Charles Perrault, and at the time I saw it and I just thought, this guy's hair is really fluffy. And then when I was doing the research for this, I kind of like looked him up and I saw the portrait and I was like, hey, I know that portrait.
Oh,
I saw that
is
in Versailles.
Wig. That's a massive wig. Oh, he's floof.
So it's so funny. It's so funny because I actually remembered that face, but I had no idea. And this is the thing I love about stories and about history and the crossover of stories and history. It's like 4 years ago when I went to Versailles and I saw that guy's portrait, I just thought he had floofy hair. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know he wrote the adaptation of the story that would like so closely like connect with me, and I would carry this story through my whole life. I'd be a defender of Cinderella to like the end of my days.
I mean, it's yeah. So he was the secretary to the minister, and he still got his portrait up in Versailles.
Well, okay, so this is what happens. So basically, the minister is like very close with the king, King Louis XIV.
Mm-hmm.
And so what King Louis XIV is trying to do at this time is he's trying to end feudalism. Feudalism isn't like a state that people are living in or having awareness of at the time. It's just like the way things were run. So
Yeah.
like there were lords, they had big swaths of land and property. They gave some of that property to people that would work the land, and they would get to live there and work the land. And in exchange, they would give the stuff over to, to the lords, and the lords would bring it all to the king. Like there's like that whole thing. That's like in my very like rough understanding of like
What
what
feudalism
feudalism.
actually is and how it
Yeah.
operated.
It's clearly like way more complicated and in depth than that, but that's like the in a
The Coles
nutshell version.
notes. Yeah.
The Cole's notes on feudalism. Yeah. Maybe we can dive into that at a different time. But anyways, so part of the way that King Louis XIV wants to do this is he wants to bring like all of the people, like the people that are part of his like royal court. He wants to bring them into Versailles. So he's convincing a whole bunch of them to like come and like live in the town, the city of Versailles,
Mm-hmm.
and be a part of this like royal court. He wants to run everything from the center of France.
Okay.
So he works quite closely with the minister, and the minister, like over the reign of this king, the minister dies, and Charles Perrault is the secretary to this minister. When the minister dies, he retires, and this is when he creates this book where he's like retelling these stories.
Do
And the
you
reason, yeah.
do you know how old he would have been? Out of curiosity?
I don't know, actually. I'd have to look it up. I don't know how old he was when he wrote the book. You can
I
maybe
wonder,
Google
like,
it.
well, I wonder how old he was when he was forced into retirement. That's interesting. Okay, so he writes.
Listen, this is France. It doesn't matter how old it is. Nobody's forced into
Oh,
retirement. People
that's
like
true.
gladly go into
They
retirement.
they do. They do. It's true.
He's still like, that's my assumption, again, speculation, but my like, I mean, like he's still, part of a really high noble court at this point and had a pretty high level job. So he's just like banking right now at
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
point, I
Yeah.
think.
Sounds good. He's of the
So
upper echelon of society.
right. And that is an important thing to look at here, is the upper echelon of society, the aristocrats, the French aristocracy, the bourgeois. En fait, it's the
Mm-hmm.
bourgeois. We hear that term like bougie, bourgeois. Like when we're talking about bourgeois, we're talking about people that were part of the court of Versailles,
Mm-hmm.
like way back when. And of course, that the meaning of who those people are has changed throughout time, but that's kind of like who they were. So,
Right.
you can think about, there's so many stories about Versailles, about King Louis XIV, about the parties, the masquerades, the gardens, just the
Yeah.
pure
Lavish
luxury of it.
excess. Yes.
So, one of the things that becomes really popular in Versailles at the time is like they'll go into the salon, which is like a living room kind of area, and they'll start telling stories. And Charles kind of like creates this new genre at the time, which is the fairy tale.
Mm-hmm.
He sets the groundwork to create the concept of the fairy tale genre. And with all of these like super fancy bourgeois French people, fairy tales start to become stories. So it's really interesting when you think of the story of Cinderella. When you think of the story of Cinderella, you think of the story of her two sisters. And you think about like in the what we think of as the modern adaptation of the story, there's a king, there's a prince, everybody wants a piece, and they all want a piece. And they want to go to this big lavish ball where they get the chance to impress him. This is very much like what was going on in Versailles at the
Interesting.
time.
It was actually real life at the time for the society that
Yeah.
he was living in.
Well, I think this is part of this is like
Yeah, this
his
is his world.
contribution to the
Yes.
story, right?
Yeah.
So like, they're all going into, and you would be, if you were part of the nobles, you would be living in that area, you would be going to parties, and
Mhm.
there would be maybe an opportunity, you come across a prince or somebody like this that you fall in love with, and then all of a sudden you're at the top, you know what I mean?
Interesting. Okay.
So it's really, really interesting. It's really interesting. So what we know is he has definitely added that element to this story, and it's the element that I think attracts a lot of people. Like even today, like I was watching Bridgerton a few weeks ago, which is about the British monarchy, but
Uh-huh.
everything about it is done in French style. Like
Right.
even the queen, like obviously we know it's absolutely not historically accurate, like whatsoever.
Yeah.
But even the queen, even the way she dresses, it's like indicative of like Marie Antoinette with the really like high wigs and the big gowns.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
this level of like absurd lavishness is very like Versailles French energy.
Mhm.
But it's also really important to think about what is happening with the people who are not part of the court at that time.
Yeah, that's the part that I'm most intrigued about, I think. And I think
Right.
the majority of the people of that time were obviously not a part of the court. They got upset and off with the heads went
Well,
the
this is it.
aristocracy. Yeah.
This is it. So, okay, so Charles writes this book at the time when King Louis XIV is the king. And this is kind of like in the height, I want to say, somebody feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but in the height of like Versailles, this lavishness and whatever.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, he is trying to get rid of feudalism. I kind of see these fairy tales as a way of like coaxing people into the idea of the lavishness of it all. But feudalism, in a way, like at the time, I would imagine a lot of people, instead of like having the situation they had always had, which they had land that they could work and that they could live and they could grow food and harvest on, this
Mhm.
is now changing, getting taken away. We're introducing new concepts into the economy, and a lot of people probably, when any of these things happen in a society, people start to struggle and people
Of
start to
course.
go through really difficult times, right?
Of course.
So you have that happening while and this is what was going on in France, right? So
Mhm.
people know that in the time of Versailles, during Versailles' heyday and many years to follow, most paysan people, like the peasant people, were suffering and they were struggling and they were getting sick and they were dying, and these bougie people were like off having these elaborate masquerades and having ideas of marrying a prince and like Cinderella story. And I think it's really, really interesting because, a lot of the time we either think of one or the other, and we don't think that the two things were actually existing at the same time
Oh, they
when they
definitely do.
they very, very
They
much
very well do.
were.
They always do. Wherever there are people who are impoverished, there are others who are profiting off their backs in some way, shape, or form.
So what I think is doubly so fascinating is not just the story of Cinderella and the adaptations of it, but the timing of it coming out and like coming into society versus what is actually going on in French culture and French aristocracy at the time. And this is kind of like what essentially is eventually going to lead to La Révolution, like
Mhm.
the great French Revolution, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's King Louis the 16th So not too far. I mean, like in terms of lifespans, yeah, it's actually still quite a bit of years. But
Yeah,
like I think it's King Louis the XVI that gets beheaded during the revolution.
I
He's the
think
king
so. Yeah.
that the people take down. So, you know, I just found it really interesting when I was like looking into this, the connection between this and what's going on, because I think there's also this sense in Cinderella, the modern adaptations, where once Cinderella meets the prince and they fall in love, once they finally get to be together, they get to lovingly rule over their subjects with equality and peace. And I think that this is the political idea that the French aristocracy wanted to put out there at the time.
It's the
It
great
was
French
clearly,
dream. They wanted to quell the masses and calm them down to make them think that they could have a better life. They could marry up in the world.
or that's what the goal is or
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
something.
yeah.
But in fact, it was like a bald faced lie. Like
Yeah, no, they just
that wasn't
used it. I
happening.
mean, uh, it was the media at the time, right? As oral tales were the
Yes.
media at the time, so that's what you
Yeah.
use to calm down your people. What they didn't realize is that as soon as you take away people's bread and there's not enough to go around, that it leads to a revolt.
Yeah. So I think it's really, really interesting. I never, up until, you know, kind of like diving into the story of this for this podcast, I never associated it with anything closely related to France or the French culture. I guess like in the various forms of the movies, I always got the sense like it was somewhere, it did kind of have like a French feel to it in a certain
Yeah.
way. You always kind of think like it could be somewhere between here, it could be like, they often make these in these princess movies, they create places that don't actually exist, but it's always got like a vaguely European vibe to it, you
Yeah,
know?
for sure. For sure.
So I never so and I have to question again whether or not that's actually like done purposefully or not, you know what I mean, in some way. But it's just so fascinating, and I never would have connected it this close. And like I'm such a geek for like learning about like French history, and I love French medieval history and stuff, so I really didn't expect this research to go to this.
I mean, oh, and at one point, I think we were talking about the significance of the glass slipper itself
Mm-hmm. Oh
because
yeah,
you
that's
can't,
right.
like, why a glass slipper? It wasn't always in a lot of other fairy tales that are Cinderella based. It's not a glass slipper. There are some where they're actually made of gold and metal, other materials. So why a glass slipper? Because it's not something that you can walk in. And you certainly can't dance in
That's
it.
That's right. We were talking about that last week when we were trying to record this podcast. And when we looked it up, it actually said it was, what did it say? It was kind of like a side eye to King Louis XIV and his like elaborateness, because he's kind of known for being this incredibly like over the top, like very decadent person. And what's more decadent than a glass slipper? So,
Yeah, it's crazy because it's just interesting to see how the story evolved. It's, yeah, what was it? Okay, intended to be a literary mascot of French economic modernity. So it's definitely a tongue-in-cheek
mm.
reference to Louis XIV.
I haven't dove into the history of this time so much yet, but it's really, really interesting. And I didn't expect to dive into it through the Cinderella story. But now that we're here, it's really fascinating. It's even like this era is really, really interesting, not just in terms of stories, in terms of Versailles, in terms of the king, but like even other things that I love, like gardens, for example. You and I both geek over gardens.
Yeah.
And like the classic like French garden, I guess when you think of the most famous version, again, you probably think of Versailles.
Hmm.
This is happening at the same time, and that garden is created like in a way to show that if you can control things, they can be beautiful. You know what I mean? So it's another way in which they're like putting this idea of like, let us control the way everything happens and everybody will be okay, even though it's not really what happens at all. But like that's the
Yeah.
constant idea they're putting out in various ways and forms. I think I saw that it was Monty Don that was talking about that in his show, French Gardens.
That's a
He
good
goes
one.
into this in depth. I
I
don't
love
know if have
Monty
you seen it?
Don. Yeah, I
I
loved
love
Monty
Monty
Don.
Don.
That's great.
Yeah.
um,
So I'm taking those words from his mouth. He talks about that in the show, and I would recommend anybody who's listening to this, if you love gardens, to check that series out because it's freaking fantastic. But yeah, it's just another example of like what they were trying to accomplish at that time, which I think is just so interesting.
okay,
It's so
so
interesting.
Cinderella is interesting because it has the definitely it's about class and it's about what was going on at the time, specifically in France, at least the version that we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about. I
Mm-hmm.
don't remember off the top of my head, was her stepmother and like her stepsisters, are they ugly in the tales? Are they described as being ugly?
I think they're not necessarily always described as being ugly, but ugly in spirit, ugly in energy, like
Mm-hmm.
greedy.
For sure,
Because I
ugly in
think,
energy. I was just wondering because, like, in a lot of these fairy tales, women are described in two categories. They're either like
mhm,
innocent, beautiful, uh, pure, kind hearted, and then, if they stand up for themselves, or in this case, if they are mean spirited. But in a lot of other cases, if they are a little more assertive and they're not as weak or as passive, they're seen as being ugly. And I was just
yeah,
trying to
it's
remember
true.
if that is the case with Cinderella as well.
Well, I think, I mean, in the other story, well, there's so many different variations of the
Mm-hmm.
story. Some of the stories, she's a twin. You know what I mean? And the sibling is a boy. You know what I mean? So
Interesting.
like, yeah. So and when these things get told as folk tales, they probably weave in and out with other stories. But like,
Oh, for sure.
if we're looking at the more modern version, and I say modern, it's like from the 16th century, 16th or 17th century, 17th century. When you're looking, like, that's still quite a while ago, but if you're looking at that particular story, I think also there's that other hidden message about, yeah, if you want to be accepted, if you want to be accepted as a good woman, you have to be a certain kind of way, you have to be kind, you can't be looked at as, like, I don't know what people today might call like a gold digger. Like, I think they really kind of give that energy and trope
Yeah.
to the mother and her two sisters, so there's that idea of like, you can't have to want it,
You
basically.
can't have to want it, but you have to be dependent on a man in order to determine your place in society.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's
So
not an
this,
oxymoron at all.
I always saw, like, I guess because I was raised with like the Disney version of Cinderella, I always saw it in a different way. I always saw the, maybe just the parts that they wanted us to see. So like the kind girl, the noble guy, and like
Mm-hmm.
them being good people together. That was kind of like the message that got drilled home to me through it growing up. And like, being able to like feed birds from your hands, and just being like that kind of kind, soft, feminine energy that you could do that. But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, go doing this like deeper dive and exploring the story more, I mean, you can really see that throughout time there's a lot of like hidden indirect messages about the way people should behave, not just women, but like society. There's a lot of conversation around classism, there's a lot of conversation around, honestly,
I think it's
like
also
there's a
like
lot of misogynist takes in it.
there is, and ultimately, like, it's about money, though. Like, even the
Yeah.
whole stepmother trope, where
Mm.
this happens in a lot of fairy tales, and it was also just because it happened commonly at the time, where women would pass away because of childbirth, or just people were dying earlier anyways, and you would have men remarry, and they would remarry and have children with this new woman. But that stepmother and their children would often view the first child, the child from the first marriage, as a threat because there was an inheritance at play. Especially when you're talking
Right.
about aristocracy, there would be an inheritance at play. And so I think that this wicked stepmother that exists in a lot of fairy tales was very much, kind of reflecting the aristocracy and poking fun at it in a little bit. And then it just became a trope that was used over and over again. But ultimately, it comes down
Yeah.
to money. Like, they are in direct
You can't,
competition.
yeah, you can't want money. You can't own your own money. So I will hand it off. Like, I think that's why the Disney chain is so famous as they are and popular as they are, because they do adapt their stories as time adapts. And, you know, there's a whole conversation versus like the cartoon that came out when we were little kids
Mm-hmm.
to the recreated movie that came out like a few years ago now. But I found, like, I don't know, have you seen the live action film of
I
Cinderella?
haven't. Is it very different?
Girl, oh my god, I've seen it twice. I've seen it twice in the movie theaters, and one time I saw it on mushrooms. And it was fucking amazing. It's a really good, like, I'm not promoting mushrooms, but I'm just saying it was a good movie to see.
If you're going to watch a movie on
Oh,
mushrooms, that's the one.
it was fun, like dresses, floaty butterfly. Oh my gosh, you have to watch that. Oh, it's so good. Anyways, it's so beautiful. But Kate Blanchett, so she's like a
Oh, well,
phenomenal actress.
yeah, she's
So
amazing.
she plays the stepmother, and never has anybody done such a good job or like a good representation of that like she does. But they have adapted the story to kind of give that sense of that her bitterness kind of comes from the fact that she was married, she was happy, and then her husband died and she lost everything, so her only choice is
Right.
to, remarry.
Right.
And this is because she's not doesn't have the right to own anything. This is where her bitterness and her resentment kind of grows out of that.
So it
So I think
explains
it's
that side.
really, yeah, so I think it's really interesting that they kind of adapted it. They've done a lot of different adaptations as time has gone on, but I think it was really good that they adapted it to include that. It doesn't make her treatment of Cinderella any less brutal or bitchy. But I mean, it does give a fuller context. And I think, like, in the early versions of these stories, honestly, up until recently, in almost all of these versions, kind of like you said, the woman is either good or she's a villain, and the villain element is very one-sided. There's no nuance, there's no understanding of, she's just a horrible woman. And I think that really sucks, because we also see that played out in society in real life, where people will just assume that a person is just a bad person based on something bad that they did without knowing the context of their life story, right?
Have you ever read any of the books by Gregory Maguire?
Mm-mm.
No? Okay, so
No.
he wrote Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister and A Lion Among
Ah.
Men, Son of a Witch, Wicked.
Mm.
So,
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, okay.
yeah, and I really liked his books. If you're interested in like a perspective on the other side, it explains why the stepsisters are the way they are, why, like, it gives you the other side of why these people maybe are so bitter, because we often lose track just in daily life. We are narrow-minded, we'll receive one perspective and then be like, well, that's the perspective, and like, this other person must be shunned. There's always another side to the story. There's always two sides to the coin. And that's not to say that the stepsisters and stepmother are in the clear, but there is a reason that they're acting the way that they are. And just getting that other perspective, while it might not make you forgive someone or think that what they're doing is okay, you might just understand a little bit more. It might just
Yeah,
explain.
nuance is important for
Yeah,
anybody. Like
absolutely.
there was a trend, I think, during COVID that was like on TikTok called No Nuance November, right? Where like people were
Hmm.
just giving their hot takes, and it's a great algorithm driver and booster. But honestly, it made me cringe because I was like, you need nuance and you need context for like everything. And it's
Hmm.
really interesting though, because like if you think of it from like a societal historical place, many of these stories for years and years weren't like it's only the very modern adaptations that are giving context and like creating context and creating nuance.
Hmm.
So prior to that, it's just a story about like um it's just the story as it is, and people are learning from that. That's the amazing things about stories, is they teach us a lot of things about how society is and the way to be in society. That's part of what their power is. So it's really
Hmm.
interesting to like cut that nuance out on that one side for, so like we're talking like centuries, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
And to
absolutely.
see what happens from that is quite wild. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. We should do a little thing at some point. I was talking about this with one of my friends, but it would be cool to do part of a series where we can do a comparison of the tale with the movie adaptation that goes with it and
Oh
see.
God, I love that. If that's something anybody listening would like to us to do, let us know, because that's super cool. Okay, so we're kind of running out of time here. I think
Yep.
we've said a lot on this. It's a really good conversation, but I appreciate this story so much more now, because it like opened up so many interesting thoughts and conversations. But before we go, I wanted to ask you, like, if you had to pick an adaptation of Cinderella that you liked the most, that you know of, like it could be film, it could be a book, it could be the Grimm's version, whatever, what would it be?
I mean, the Grimm Brothers adaptation is probably my favorite. It's I have a thing for weird, dark, twisted stories, apparently.
Okay, good. So, without giving too much away on the Grimm's version, I think we're going to end up doing a podcast specifically dedicated to the Grimm's versions of these tales. So, we'll keep you guys posted on that for sure when we do it.
Yeah, it'll be available on our Patreon.
Yeah. I would have to say that my favorite adaptation of this story is the 1998 movie Ever After with Drew Barrymore. I
Oh, I
absolutely
forgot about that. Okay.
love that. I love it so much. It's for sure my favorite one. And I think it's like the beginning of we start to see her starting asserting herself as a character, getting some more of her. She's way more stubborn and way more independent in that
Mm-hmm.
story. Also in the opening, I was watching the opening before we got together, and the lady is who's retelling the story is actually telling it to the brothers Grimm, because she thinks that their version is a bit a bit
Yeah,
a bit
well,
ouchy.
their version is definitely ouchy. Oh, okay. I completely
Yeah.
forgot about Ever After. That is, yeah, that is a cute movie.
Oh my gosh. Okay, never mind the fact that I watched the movie preview before we did this, and they have Lorena McKenna like doing the, what is that? Lorena McKenna had a really famous song in the late 90s, the Mummers Dance. I don't know if you know this song. Oh,
Not
I'm
off the
so
top of
obsessed.
my head. Maybe if
What?
I heard it,
Oh,
I'll search
you
for it
have
after.
homework.
I'll search for it
I have to give
afterwards.
you homework. Just literally just look up the Ever After like trailer, because it's in the
Okay.
trailer. It's such a good song. I'm like a huge fan of Lorena McKenna, and if people don't know, Lorena McKenna is kind of like a Celtic music, world music artist. She's amazing. But her vibe is so cool and I love it. And yeah, so they kind of use her song to kind of open up the story of Ever After, but there's just something about the way that they combine the story, the way that they combine it with like Leonardo da Vinci and the Renaissance and
Hmm.
like all of this kind of stuff, that I think really makes ever after, one of the best adaptations of Cinderella.
Okay, maybe I'll
And
watch it later.
oh, have you seen it?
Yeah, I need a refresher. Like, it's been so many years since I've seen it.
I'm
It's
like,
been
don't
over
tell
a
me you haven't
decade.
seen that one either.
No, it's been over a decade though.
Yeah,
Like,
no, it's definitely worth a rewatch.
yeah.
And the coolest thing is I did some research when I moved to Toulouse not too long, like when I moved to Toulouse a couple of years ago. I moved there in 2016. So I think it was probably like around 2018. I was watching the movie again because I love it. And I did some research, and there's like a whole bunch of the filming locations are not so far here from where I
Oh,
live.
really? Have you gone on your own little tour?
Not yet, but I mean, I'm starting to develop tours around the southwest of France. So I would love to do a Cinderella tour one day.
I'll go
Like it
on the
would be like
tour.
it would be like a film location tour type thing, but
Yeah, that'd
it's
be
still
fun.
really,
But the area that you live in is so beautiful, so it'd be great.
yeah. So it would be interesting. It's something I would love to do. Maybe the next time you guys come and visit, we can do it. We'll just like figure it out.
Yeah,
We'll
we can
go on a
go, and
road trip.
we can get some of what was that wine that you discovered in Toulouse? Of the
Oh, you mean like
um
the Hippocras?
Hippocras, yeah.
Oh yeah,
We
that's
can like go on tour and have some Hippocras. It'd be
I
lovely.
didn't I didn't even tell you guys. So I didn't know about it when you were here. But after you
Yeah,
guys
you
left,
found the shop, right?
I found a shop that had way more variants, and they also have a medieval variant that's made with blackberries. They also have a Renaissance variant that's made with violets.
Ooh, that's pretty.
And they have a Gallo-Roman version that's made
That's
with
cool.
rosemary.
That's really cool.
I know. Honestly, I would have gotten them had I known when you guys were. You just have to come back,
Yeah,
basically.
it's fine. We'll come back.
Okay. Anyways, this has been such a fun, interesting journey. I love watching how stories like fairy tales can like interweave with history and influence people and all of these things like that. So thank you guys so much for listening. And what are we talking about in the next one?
I'm going to be talking about Snow White, which is
Ooh, this is
very
going to take us in a bit of a
interesting.
different direction for a while. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, well,
Awesome.
yeah, there's two directions that I'm going to take it in, but we'll get there.
Yay. Okay, we'll get there. All right, thank you guys so much for listening, and let us know if there's a story that you want us to talk about. We are always open and we love to learn. So yeah, let us know. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day
Or
or night
night.
or wherever you are, whatever you're doing.
We'll see you next time.